The summer heat beat down on Liberty Avenue as Officer James Morrison sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers impatiently against the steering wheel. It was another boring Thursday afternoon in downtown Metro City, and he was in a foul mood. His coffee had spilled on his uniform that morning, and his supervisor had criticized his latest report for being too aggressive, again. The police radio crackled to life. Unit 247, we have a noise complaint at the Metro Community Center on 5th Street. Multiple calls about loud music. Morrison grabbed the radio. Unit 247 responding. A small smile crossed his face. The community center was in a predominantly black neighborhood, and everyone knew about Morrison's reputation there. Other officers avoided patrolling that area because of his territorial behavior. As he pulled up to the community center, Morrison could hear gospel music playing. Not even that loud, but he didn't care. He adjusted his badge, making sure it caught the sunlight. At 45 years old, with 18 years on the force, Morrison believed he commanded respect, or at least he demanded it. Inside the community center, elderly men and women were setting up for what looked like some kind of meeting. Chairs were arranged in a circle, and posters about youth mentorship covered the walls. The gospel music played from a small portable speaker in the corner. That's when Morrison first saw her. Dr. Eleanor Washington stood by a table, sorting through some papers. At 68 years old, she wore a simple but elegant blue dress, her silver hair neatly styled, and reading glasses perched on her nose. She had the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of breaking barriers and helping others, though Morrison didn't bother to notice any of that. "Who's in charge here?" Morrison barked, his voice echoing through the room. The music stopped abruptly as everyone turned to look at him. Dr. Washington stepped forward calmly. "I am. Is there a problem, officer?" Morrison towered over her, deliberately invading her personal space. "We've got noise complaints. This little party of yours is disturbing the peace." "Officer," Dr. Washington spoke firmly but politely, "we have a permit for this event. The music was barely audible outside, and we're setting up a youth mentorship program to help reduce juvenile crime in the neighborhood. Perhaps you'd like to participate." Her calm response and the mention of paperwork only irritated Morrison more. In his mind, these people were always trying to prove him wrong, always trying to make him look bad. "Listen here," he growled, stepping even closer. "I don't care about your permit. When I say there's a problem, there's a problem." Several people had started recording with their phones, but Morrison was too angry to notice. Dr. Washington stood her ground, maintaining eye contact with the aggressive officer. "Officer Morrison," she said, reading his nameplate, "I understand you're doing your job, but there's no need for this hostile approach. We can discuss this civilly." The fact that she used his name, that she dared to tell him how to do his job, made something snap inside Morrison. Before anyone could react, his hand shot out, striking Dr. Washington across the face with enough force to knock her glasses off. The room fell silent, then erupted in shocked gasps and cries of outrage. Dr. Washington slowly bent down to pick up her glasses, her hands steady despite what had just happened. When she stood up again, her eyes held something Morrison had never seen before in his victims. Not fear, not even anger, but a kind of knowing determination that should have warned him about what was coming. "Badge number 7734, she said quietly, memorizing it. "Thank you, Officer Morrison. You may go now." Morrison felt a moment of uncertainty, something about her composure making him uncomfortable, but he pushed the feeling aside, puffing up his chest. "Next time, keep the noise down," he spat out, turning on his heel and storming out of the community center. As he left, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this incident. He had no idea that this Thursday afternoon would change his life forever, or that the elderly woman he had just assaulted would soon hold his entire career in her hands. Behind him, Dr. Eleanor Washington pulled out her phone and made a single call. "Yes, Governor? I believe I've just found my first project as the new police commissioner." By nightfall, Officer Morrison's actions at the community center had become the talk of Metro City. The videos spread like wildfire across social media, showing different angles of his assault on Dr. Washington. But while Morrison slept soundly that night, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him, the wheels of justice were already turning. At the Metro City Police Station, Captain Rodriguez sat at his desk, rubbing his temples as he watched the video for the 10th time. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident. News stations wanted comments, community leaders demanded action, and his superiors were breathing down his neck. Morrison had gone too far this time. Meanwhile, Dr. Eleanor Washington sat in her home office, carefully writing notes about the day's events. Her cheek still stung where Morrison had slapped her, but she touched it with a slight smile. In her 40-year career, first as an FBI agent, then as a federal judge, and now as the soon-to-be-announced police commissioner, she had dealt with many Officer Morrisons. But this one would be different. "Are you sure you don't want to press charges right away?" asked her daughter Sarah over the phone. Sarah was a civil rights attorney and was ready to file a lawsuit first thing in the morning. "No, dear," Dr. Washington replied calmly, looking at a folder marked Police Reform Initiative on her desk. "Sometimes justice needs to be more than punishment. It needs to be a lesson." The next morning, the community center was packed. Local news crews set up their cameras outside as Reverend Jackson, a longtime community leader, addressed the angry crowd inside. "We've seen this before," he shouted, standing where Dr. Washington had been slapped the day before. "Officer Morrison has been terrorizing our community for years, but this time we have proof." The crowd cheered in agreement. Signs reading "Fire Morrison" and "Police Accountability Now" waved in the air, but just as the energy in the room reached its peak, Dr. Washington walked in, commanding attention without saying a word. She made her way to the podium, adjusting her glasses as the room fell silent. Even the reporters stopped their chatter, sensing something important was about to happen. "My friends," she began, her voice firm but gentle, "I understand your anger. Yesterday, I experienced firsthand what many of you have been telling me about for years." She paused, looking around the room. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for change." In another part of the city, Morrison walked into his favorite diner for breakfast, completely oblivious to the fact that his face was on every news channel. The waitress, Mary, who usually greeted him with a smile, just stared at him coldly as she poured his coffee. "Rough day yesterday?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she nodded toward the TV where his video was playing. Morrison looked up and nearly choked on his coffee. There he was, in crystal clear quality, slapping an elderly woman. His phone, which he'd ignored all morning, had dozens of missed calls from the station. Back at the community center, Dr. Washington was finishing her speech. "Starting next week, I will take on a new role in this city. And I promise you, what happened yesterday will become a catalyst for real change." The crowd erupted in applause, though most didn't yet understand the full meaning behind her words. Reporter Sandra Chen from Channel 5 News tried to get more details, but Dr. Washington just smiled mysteriously. "All will be clear very soon," she said, gathering her things. "For now, let's just say that Officer Morrison's actions yesterday will have consequences he never expected." As the day wound down, Morrison sat in his patrol car, avoiding calls from his supervisor and trying to convince himself this would all blow over. He'd gotten away with similar incidents before, maybe not quite this bad, but close enough. The system had always protected him. What he didn't know was that Dr. Washington was currently sitting in the governor's office, finalizing the details of her appointment as police commissioner. She held a thick file in her hands, Morrison's complete service record, filled with civilian complaints that had been buried over the years. "Are you sure you don't want to delay your appointment after what happened?" the governor asked, concerned about the optics. Dr. Washington shook her head, a determined glint in her eye. "On the contrary, Governor. Officer Morrison just helped me identify exactly where to start our reforms." Monday morning arrived with dark clouds hanging over Metro City. Officer James Morrison walked into the police station with his usual arrogant stride, though he'd spent a miserable weekend avoiding phone calls and news coverage about the slapping incident. He figured he'd get a stern talking to, maybe a few days of desk duty, and everything would blow over like always. The station was unusually quiet. Officers who normally greeted him were suddenly very interested in their paperwork. Even his usual supporters wouldn't meet his eyes. Something felt different this time. "Morrison," Captain Rodriguez's voice boomed across the room. "All officers in the main hall in 5 minutes. Mandatory meeting." Officers began filing into the main hall, which was typically used for major announcements and award ceremonies. Morrison found a spot near the back, crossing his arms and leaning against the wall. He noticed several city officials and news cameras setting up at the front of the room. "What's all this about?" he muttered to Officer Thompson standing next to him. Thompson stepped away without answering, leaving Morrison standing alone. The room was packed now, buzzing with whispers and expectation. The mayor walked in first, followed by the governor and several other officials. Morrison's stomach started to feel uneasy. This was bigger than he'd expected. "Officers of Metro City Police Department," the governor began, stepping up to the podium. "As you know, our city has faced numerous challenges regarding police-community relations. Today marks a new chapter in our department's history. I'm proud to introduce your new police commissioner." Morrison's phone buzzed in his pocket. Another text from his union representative trying to reach him about the slapping incident. He ignored it, still convinced he could handle things his way. "Please welcome Commissioner Dr. Eleanor Washington." The room erupted in applause as Dr. Washington walked in, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit. Morrison's face turned ghost white. His legs went weak, and he had to grab the wall to steady himself. It was her, the woman he had slapped at the community center. Dr. Washington stood at the podium, her presence commanding the room. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, though partly covered with makeup. Every officer in the room knew exactly how it got there, thanks to the viral videos. "Thank you, Governor," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I accept this position with both humility and determination. Our department needs change, and that change begins today." Morrison tried to quietly slip toward the door, but Captain Rodriguez blocked his path with a stern look that said, "Don't even think about it." "Some of you may recognize me from an incident last Thursday at the Metro Community Center," Dr. Washington continued, her eyes scanning the room until they found Morrison. "That incident, while unfortunate, perfectly illustrates why I'm here." The room fell so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Every head turned to look at Morrison, who was now sweating profusely. "In my 40 years of public service, as an FBI agent, federal judge, and civil rights advocate, I've learned that real change requires more than just punishment. It requires transformation." She opened a folder on the podium. "Officer James Morrison, please step forward." Morrison's feet felt like lead as he slowly made his way to the front. Each step echoed in the silent room. Social media videos of him slapping Dr. Washington played on loop on the screens behind her, making him flinch with each replay. "Officer Morrison," Dr. Washington addressed him directly, "your actions last Thursday were a disgrace to this badge. Your record shows 17 complaints of excessive force, 12 instances of racial profiling, and numerous reports of aggressive behavior, all swept under the rug." Morrison stared at the floor, his face burning with shame as his entire career of misconduct was laid bare before his colleagues. "However," Dr. Washington continued, "instead of firing you immediately, which would be well within my rights, I have something else in mind." She closed the folder and looked directly at him. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be the first officer in our new comprehensive reform program. You'll work directly under my supervision, Officer Morrison. Every day, every report, every interaction with the public, I'll be watching." The color drained from Morrison's face as the full reality of his situation hit him. The woman he had assaulted, whose decades of law enforcement experience far outweighed his own, was now his boss. And not just his boss. She was the boss of every officer in the room. "Welcome to the new Metro City Police Department," Dr. Washington concluded, a slight smile playing on her lips. "Things are about to change around here." The day after Commissioner Washington's announcement, Officer Morrison sat alone in a small office, staring at a mountain of paperwork. The office, barely bigger than a closet, had become his new workspace. Gone was his comfortable desk in the main area where he used to hold court with his supporters. Now he had a wobbly chair, a flickering fluorescent light, and a clear view of the commissioner's office across the hall. Officer Morrison called the commissioner's assistant, poking her head in. "Dr. Washington wants to see you with your complete case files from the past 5 years." Now, Morrison gathered his files with shaking hands. In all his years on the force, no one had ever done a deep dive into his cases. His supervisors had always looked the other way, but he knew Dr. Washington wouldn't. The commissioner's office was large and bright, with community awards and law enforcement certificates covering the walls. Dr. Washington sat behind her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose, examining a thick folder. Sit down, Officer Morrison, she said without looking up. We have a lot to discuss. Morrison sat awkwardly in the chair facing her desk. The bruise on her cheek was fading, but its presence still made him squirm with guilt. Let's start with the Thompson case from last year, she said, pulling out a file. You arrested a young black man for suspicious behavior while he was waiting for a bus. The charges were dropped, but he lost his job because of the arrest. Explain. He matched the description of a suspect, Morrison stammered. The suspect was 6'2". Mr. Thompson is 5'7". Dr. Washington looked at him over her glasses. Try again. For the next 3 hours, Dr. Washington methodically went through case after case. Each time Morrison tried to justify his actions, she countered with facts, witness statements, and evidence he'd ignored or buried. This pattern stops now, she finally said, closing the last file. Starting tomorrow, you'll be reassigned to community service duty. Every person you've wrongly arrested, every family you've harassed, you're going to make it right. But Commissioner, Morrison protested, that's not real police work. Real police work? Dr. Washington's voice turned sharp. Real police work is protecting and serving all members of our community, not just the ones you decide are worthy. She handed him a new schedule. Morrison's eyes widened as he read it. Morning shifts at the homeless shelter, afternoon mentoring at the youth center, evening community meetings, he read in disbelief. And detailed reports on each interaction, which I'll review personally, Dr. Washington added. Plus, you'll be wearing a body camera that cannot be turned off. Every word, every action will be recorded. Morrison slumped in his chair. His whole world was turning upside down. Oh, and one more thing, Dr. Washington continued, pushing a stack of letters across her desk. These are complaints from citizens about your conduct. You're going to personally apologize to each one of them, face to face. But that's dozens of people, Morrison exclaimed. 73, to be exact, she corrected him. And each apology will be sincere and specific to their case. I'll be monitoring these meetings personally. Just then, Captain Rodriguez walked in with more files. Commissioner, we found these additional complaints in the archived records. Morrison watched in horror as another stack of folders landed on the desk. Thank you, Captain, Dr. Washington said. Officer Morrison was just leaving to prepare for his first community service shift tomorrow. 6 a.m. sharp at the homeless shelter, isn't that right, officer? Morrison nodded numbly, standing up on shaky legs. One last thing, Dr. Washington called as he reached the door. That slap you gave me? It showed me exactly who you are. But these next few months will show me who you can become. Don't waste this opportunity, Officer Morrison. It's your last one. As Morrison walked back to his tiny office, other officers avoided eye contact. His phone buzzed. A notification from the department's new accountability app, showing his schedule, body camera status, and a countdown to his first mandated apology meeting. He looked through the window at Dr. Washington, who was already focused on her next task. For the first time in his career, Officer James Morrison felt something he'd never experienced before, the weight of real accountability. 1 month into his new assignment, Officer Morrison stood in front of the Metro City homeless shelter at 5:45 a.m., his pressed uniform feeling strangely uncomfortable. His body camera blinked steadily on his chest, recording every moment of his day, just as it had for the past 30 days. Morning, Officer Morrison, said Miss Betty, the shelter's elderly coordinator. When he first started, she watched him like a hawk, not trusting the cop who'd harassed homeless people for years. Now she handed him a cup of coffee with a slight smile. Good morning, Miss Betty, Morrison replied, his voice softer than it used to be. The past month had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. Inside the shelter, people were waking up. Morrison remembered his first day here, how residents had shrunk away from him in fear, some even leaving their breakfast behind when he entered the room. Today, a few nodded at him, while others continued their morning routines without panic. His radio crackled. Officer Morrison, this is Commissioner Washington. Remember you have youth mentoring at 2 p.m. and your evening apology meeting at 7. Understood, Commissioner, he responded, checking his accountability app. Today's apology would be to the Thompson family, the young man he wrongly arrested at the bus stop. His stomach tightened at the thought. By noon, Morrison had helped serve breakfast, assisted 3 homeless veterans with housing applications, and broken up a minor dispute without using force, something that surprised even him. His body camera recorded it all. At 2 p.m. sharp, he arrived at the Metro Youth Center, the same place where he'd slapped Dr. Washington just a month ago. The memory made him wince. Officer Morrison called out Deander, a 14-year-old who'd been assigned as his first mentee. "I got a B+ on my math test." A month ago, Morrison would have ignored the boy's achievement. Now, he found himself genuinely smiling. "That's great work, Deander. See? Those extra study sessions paid off." The youth center was filled with kids from the neighborhood. Morrison remembered how he used to view them as potential troublemakers. Now he knew their names, their struggles, their dreams. Commissioner Washington walked in during the homework session, observing silently from the doorway. She watched as Morrison patiently helped a group of students with their assignments, his demeanor completely different from the angry officer she first encountered. "Officer Morrison," she called out after the session, "walk with me." They stepped outside into the afternoon sun. Morrison noticed she no longer had any trace of the bruise he'd given her, but the memory still filled him with shame. "I've been reviewing your progress," Dr. Washington said, pulling out her tablet. "The shelter reports positive interactions. The youth center says attendance has actually increased. And your body camera footage shows significant improvement in your communication style." Morrison nodded, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "However," she continued, "tonight's apology meeting will be your biggest test yet. The Thompson family has agreed to hear you out. This time, I need more than just words, Officer Morrison. I need you to show them how you've changed." At 7 p.m., Morrison sat across from Marcus Thompson and his family in the commissioner's office. His hands were sweating, his mouth dry. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "a year ago, I arrested you for no reason except my own prejudice. I ruined your job prospects, hurt your family, and worst of all, I never saw you as a human being." The words came from a place of truth he hadn't known existed within him. He told them about his month at the shelter, about working with kids like Marcus's younger brother, about finally understanding the damage he'd caused. Commissioner Washington watched the scene unfold, noting how Morrison's body language had changed from defensive to genuinely remorseful. The Thompson family, initially tense, began to relax as Morrison spoke from his heart. "I can't undo what I did," Morrison concluded, "but I can promise you this. I'm not the same officer who arrested you, and I never will be again." After the Thompsons left, Dr. Washington called Morrison back to her office. "That was real progress, officer," she said. "But remember, tomorrow starts another day of proving yourself. Real change isn't about one moment, it's about every moment after." Morrison nodded, understanding for the first time that this wasn't just a program he needed to complete. It was becoming the person he should have been all along. 3 months into Commissioner Washington's reform program, Officer Morrison stood in front of a mirror in the police station's locker room, adjusting his badge. The face that looked back at him seemed different somehow, softer, more thoughtful, with lines of worry where arrogance used to be. "Morrison," called Officer Chen from the doorway. "There's a situation at Martin Luther King High School. Commissioner Washington wants you there." Time was when Morrison would have rushed in with sirens blaring, ready to assert his authority. Today, he drove calmly to the school, mentally reviewing the de-escalation techniques he'd learned. At the school, he found 2 teenage boys squared off in the parking lot, a crowd of students around them recording with their phones. Morrison recognized one of them, Jamal, a regular from the youth center's tutoring program. "Hey, Jamal," Morrison called out softly, stepping between the boys. The crowd fell silent, some students still remembering the viral video of him slapping Dr. Washington. They waited to see what this supposedly changed officer would do. "Officer Morrison?" Jamal lowered his fists, surprised. He said my sister was." "Let's talk about it," Morrison said, gesturing for both boys to step aside. "Remember what we discussed at the center about handling conflict." The crowd watched in amazement as Morrison sat with both boys on a nearby bench, listening to each side of the story. No shouting, no handcuffs, no threats, just conversation. From her car across the street, Commissioner Washington observed the scene, taking notes on her tablet. Her experiment with Morrison was working better than she'd expected. Later that afternoon, Morrison led his first community police training session. The same community center where he'd slapped Dr. Washington was now filled with other officers, there to learn from his experience. 4 months ago, I was the kind of cop who thought force was the answer to everything, Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-learned lessons. I was wrong. Let me show you what I've learned. He shared stories from his time at the homeless shelter, the youth center, and his apology meetings. He showed body camera footage comparing his old approach to his new one. The other officers, many of whom had once looked up to his aggressive style, listened intently. "Remember Mr. Thompson?" Morrison asked the room. "The man I wrongly arrested at the bus stop. He's now teaching computer skills at our youth center. The same man I tried to destroy is helping build our community. That's what happens when we serve instead of suppress." During the presentation, Commissioner Washington slipped quietly into the back of the room. She watched as the officer who had once struck her now taught others about respect, dignity, and community policing. After the session, a young rookie officer approached Morrison. "Sir, I used to think being tough was what made a good cop. But watching you change, it's made me rethink everything." Morrison placed a hand on the rookie's shoulder. "Being tough is easy. Being just and fair, that's the real challenge." That evening, as Morrison completed his daily reports in his small office, Dr. Washington called him in. "I saw you at the school today," she said, reviewing the body camera footage on her screen. "Time was you would have had those boys in handcuffs before asking a single question." Morrison nodded. "I kept thinking about what you told me, that every interaction is a chance to either build trust or break it." Dr. Washington removed her glasses, studying the man before her. "Do you know why I didn't fire you that day, Officer Morrison?" "I've wondered about that, Commissioner. Because firing you would have been easy. Everyone expected it. But true justice isn't about punishment, it's about transformation. And you, Officer Morrison, are becoming living proof of that." She handed him a new assignment sheet. "Starting next week, you'll be helping train officers at other precincts. Your story, your real story, needs to be heard." Morrison took the papers, his hands steady. "Thank you, Commissioner. Not just for the opportunity, but for seeing something in me that I couldn't see myself." As he left her office, Morrison passed the spot where he'd first seen Dr. Washington all those months ago. The angry, prejudiced officer who'd raised his hand that day felt like a stranger now, someone he used to know, but never wanted to be again. 6 months had passed since the slapping incident that changed everything. Officer Morrison stood at the podium in City Hall's main conference room, facing a crowd of reporters, community leaders, and fellow officers. The giant screen behind him showed two images: his viral slapping video on one side and recent footage of him working with community youth on the other. "My name is Officer James Morrison," he began, his voice steady but humble. 6 months ago, I was the biggest problem in our police department. Today, I'm here to share my story of change." Commissioner Washington sat in the front row, watching the man she had transformed from her greatest challenge into one of her most successful examples of reform. "I was an officer who used fear instead of respect," Morrison continued. "I judged people by their color, not their character. And then, I made the biggest mistake of my career. I assaulted the one person who would later become my greatest teacher." The room fell silent as Morrison gestured toward Dr. Washington. Some people in the audience still remembered their outrage at the viral video. But now, they were witnessing something rare, genuine redemption. "Commissioner Washington could have fired me. She could have pressed charges. Instead, she chose to show me a better way." Morrison's voice cracked slightly. "She made me work in the very communities I had harmed. She made me face every person I had wronged. And most importantly, she made me see the humanity in everyone I meet." He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the past 6 months. Complaints against officers down by 40%, community trust ratings up by 35%, youth program participation doubled. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Morrison said. "Let me show you what real change looks like." The doors opened, and people began walking in. Marcus Thompson, now a successful lit trainer, Deandra from the youth center, holding his college acceptance letter, Miss Betty from the homeless shelter, and dozens of others whose lives had intersected with Morrison's journey. These people, Morrison gestured to the group. They taught me more about being a good police officer than my entire previous career. They showed me that true strength isn't about power, it's about service. In the audience, veteran officers who had once followed Morrison's aggressive example were nodding, some wiping away tears. The local news cameras captured it all, creating a very different kind of viral moment for Morrison. After the presentation, Commissioner Washington approached the podium where Morrison was gathering his papers. "Officer Morrison," she said, "there's someone here who wants to meet you." A young black officer in training stepped forward. "Sir, I almost quit the academy when I saw that video of you 6 months ago," she admitted. "But watching your transformation, it gave me hope that real change is possible." Morrison looked at Dr. Washington, who nodded encouragingly. "Would you like to join me at the youth center tomorrow?" he asked the trainee. "The real training happens there, not in the academy." Later that evening, Morrison sat in his small office, reading letters from community members. Each one told a story of how his change had affected them. Some were from people he wronged, now writing about forgiveness. Others were from fellow officers, sharing how his example had changed their approach to policing. Commissioner Washington knocked on his door, holding a familiar file, his original complaint record. "Do you remember what I told you the day I became commissioner?" she asked. Morrison nodded. "That the slap showed you exactly who I was, that the following months would show who I could become." "Well," she smiled, dropping the file in the shredder, "I think we've seen exactly who you've become." She handed him a new badge. "Starting next month, you'll be heading our new Community Relations Division. Your job will be to train other officers in everything you've learned. Think you're ready for that?" Morrison stood, holding the new badge with reverence. 6 months ago, I would have said yes without thinking. Now I know enough to say I'll keep learning every day. As he left the station that night, Morrison passed the community center where it all began. The lights were on. A youth program was in session. Through the window, he could see young people and officers working together, talking, laughing. He touched his cheek, remembering the slap that had set everything in motion. Sometimes, he realized, your worst moment can lead to your best transformation if someone believes in you enough to show you the way. 1 year had passed since the day Officer Morrison slapped Dr. Washington at the Metro Community Center. Today, the same building was decorated with banners announcing the first annual Metro City Police Community Partnership celebration. Morrison stood outside, adjusting his new uniform with the Community Relations Division badge. He smiled, remembering how he used to strike fear in this neighborhood. Now, children waved at him as they entered the building with their parents. "Officer Morrison," called Deander, now a high school senior, "we saved you a seat up front." Inside, the community center was packed. The old folding chairs had been replaced with new ones, bought with funds from Morrison's community policing initiative. The walls displayed photos of officers and residents working together, a timeline of change over the past year. Commissioner Washington took the stage, looking elegant as ever. The crowd fell silent, many remembering that dramatic day when Morrison had slapped her in this very room. 1 year ago, she began, a single act of violence in this room could have deepened the divide between police and community. Instead, it became the catalyst for remarkable change. She gestured to a large screen showing security footage from that day, but this time it was followed by clips of transformation. Morrison serving at the homeless shelter, mentoring youth, training officers, building bridges. "Officer James Morrison," Dr. Washington called out, "please join me on stage." Morrison walked up, his steps steady but humble. The same people who had once recorded his worst moment on their phones were now smiling at him, some even giving thumbs up. "A year ago, I slapped this woman." Morrison addressed the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was untouchable. I thought I was right. I was wrong on both counts." He turned to Dr. Washington. "You didn't just change my career, Commissioner. You changed my heart." Dr. Washington smiled, then unveiled a new plaque for the community center, the Morrison Washington Initiative for Police Reform. "This center," she announced, "will now serve as a national training facility for community-based policing. Officers from across the country will come here to learn what real change looks like." The crowd erupted in applause. In the audience, Morrison spotted familiar faces. Marcus Thompson, now running the center's computer lab, Miss Betty from the homeless shelter, sitting with several officers who now volunteered there. His former rookie trainee, who had just been promoted to community liaison. But the real celebration today, Dr. Washington continued, is not about programs or initiatives. It's about proving that change is possible. That one moment of darkness can lead to endless moments of light. She handed Morrison a large envelope. Inside was a photo album filled with before and after pictures. Morrison angry and aggressive in the old photos, compassionate and engaged in the new ones. "Keep this," she said softly, "to remind you of how far you've come." As the celebration continued, Morrison walked around the center, stopping to talk with people who had been part of his journey. Each conversation was a reminder of how much had changed, not just in the department, but in himself. Near the end of the event, a new police recruit approached him. "Sir," she said nervously, "I saw the viral video of you last year. I almost didn't join the force because of it. But then I saw the videos of your change. You're the reason I'm here." Morrison looked at Dr. Washington, who was watching from across the room. She gave him a knowing nod. "Let me tell you about my first day as a real police officer," he told the recruit. "It started with a slap, but it ended with a lesson I'll never forget. Sometimes your biggest mistake can become your greatest opportunity for change." As the celebration wound down, Morrison and Dr. Washington stood together in the exact spot where everything had changed a year ago. "Ready for another year?" she asked. Morrison looked around at the transformed community center, at the officers and residents chatting like old friends, at the future they had built from the ashes of his mistake. "Ready," he replied. "But this time, I'm keeping my hands to myself." Dr. Washington laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that echoed through the room. It was the sound of healing, of bridges built, of wounds transformed into wisdom. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the community center windows. But inside, the light of change was shining brighter than ever.